between rural people and urban people. Rural living and urban living, we know that. And it's not that rural is better than urban, even if you feel that way, and it's not that urban is better than rural, even if you would feel that way. But we know that there is some real differences between rural living and urban living. Now, as rural people, what are some of the things that you really appreciate about rural living? Being a resident within the Pembina Valley, because we're not just Morden residents here, we represent Morden, we represent Manitou. We had some Miami affiliation there once upon a time, and Darlingford, from the county of Darlingford, you're not from Darlingford? Well, okay, you're from the country then. And but we have a mix. What are some of the things? What are some of the things that you, as a resident of the Pembina Valley, really, really love? What is it that you love about it here?
Friendly people.
Friendly people. Urban people might say there's some friendly people there too. But that's a good one. They are definitely friendly. They're I don't know. I don't want to say down to earth because then that's involved, right? Yep.
We share.
We share. Okay.
Pay it forward.
We pay it forward. Okay. What are some other things that you really love about Pembina Valley?
Small commutes to work.
Yeah, there's a big one. Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Even an urban person will tell you that on that. Yeah. There's a lot of things. There's a lot of things that we love, and of course, urban people will have their things that they really like too. We've got, amenities. There's things to do. They find, the fast pace probably they enjoy it a little bit more than maybe the slow pace possibly. The truth of the matter is that we are all molded by our environment. We really are. We are, the places, we're accustomed to the area that we're spending our years in, and we're okay with that. It works for us. And, it's good. But here's one of the common rubs. Me as a rural person, but it's the crowds, And I know that we are halfway through this year. Christmas is a long way away. But Christmas in the malls in the city is something I don't really look forward to. It's when you kind of feel like you just feel like your space is crowded and no one's really touching you, but they're really close to the bubble, aren't they? They're kind of right in your bubble, and you don't really, just respect my space, please. And so that's one of the things that I think that as rural people we really, really like is we like our space. And as we've been going through our lectionary readings, what they have been doing, they've been taking us through the book of Mark, haven't they? I think right from chapter 1 all the way to where we are now in chapter 5. And to this point, in chapter 5, there has been an enormous amount of stuff, an enormous amount of action that has taken place in chapters 1, 2, and 3, and 4. And within some of those markers, you have Jesus appointing his 12 disciples, even one that he knew was going to eventually betray him. He appoints him as well. That's in chapter 3. And then we see Jesus, he's in his home. He arrives home, and he questions there's the question of who his true relatives are. He explains who he feels his relatives are. And then he's speaking in parables, something that almost seems had not been done before, but he did it with excellence. And everything he said, everything he taught and proclaimed and declared seemed to come through parables. And there seemed to be this secrecy and this hiddenness within like an underlying message that they had to think through and try to discover and grapple through. And then there are these miracles, these astonishing things that would happen. People being healed of illnesses. Even the nature itself would listen to him. In chapter 5, or 4 I should say, where he tells the storm to be silent, and the storm is silent. And then in chapter 5, the verses that just precede the ones that Cheryl had read, there's this healing of a man who had not just one demon, but many demons. And he heals them. And it's an incredible story in and of itself. And all these series of events, they happen around this, what probably was at one point in time, this quiet lakeside, this seashore, and yet it was crowded with people. There was these crowds that were just clamoring to get a view of this man that they knew not very much about, or had heard very much, but they were hearing things about him. And their curiosity was captivating them. They wanted to see who this was and hear a little bit of what he had to say, because he spoke with such authority. He had spoke with such passion and compassion. And even powerful people in authority wouldn't know what to say in response to him. And he seemed to be able to speak with them so powerfully, and even the spiritual realm, even demons themselves would listen to this man and flee from him. Who was this man? And that's the very question that the disciples asked in chapter 4, or yes, in chapter 4, when this storm is raging wild, and their boat, it looks like it's going to capsize. It looks like they're done. And he gets up and he says to the waters, "Be still, be silent." And the water becomes silent. This raging sea becomes calm, flats. Who is this man that even the very sea will listen to him? And the crowds of people, they were swelling in numbers by the day, and they were following fast after him. And many within these crowds, they were vying for his attention. They had something that they had within them that they wanted to bring to him, and there was this deep sense of awe within the people who were seeking him out. And that brings us to chapter 5, to two miracles that we read of in verses 21 through 43. And our story begins with Jesus standing on a lakeside shoreline, where he lands on this lakeside shoreline. And immediately upon getting out of his boat, the crowds were already there. They are obviously aware of the direction in which Jesus and the disciples were going in, because they were waiting for him when they got to the shoreline. And entering the scene is a man by the name of Jairus. And Jairus is a synagogue leader, and he's working his way through this maze of people that are there. And he falls at the feet of Jesus, and he pleads with them to come with him, to go with him to his home, because his little girl is sick, 12-year-old little girl. She's dying. And it's very interesting, isn't it? Because here you have a Jewish religious leader from one of the synagogues who's seeking Jesus out. And one would think that a man in such position would be in opposition to Jesus. And although we don't know much about Jairus, we can assume fairly accurately that enough has happened and enough has been said that could be authenticated as true. And he's convinced that Jesus can make his daughter well. And he's desperate, and he loves his little girl more than life itself. And he's not worried about the ramifications of coming near Jesus. He doesn't care what his contemporaries or what his religious peers may think or feel about him drawing close to Jesus, asking for help from him, falling at his feet. He's not concerned about any of that. Enough has happened that he is convinced in coming to Jesus and in bearing his soul to him, he felt that and believed that was worth the risk. Worth risking his reputation, worth risking his livelihood. It was worth the life of his daughter to do what he did. And Jesus hears his plea. And without a response, he just follows. He follows Jairus. He's on his way to Jairus' home to see this sick little girl. But they didn't get very far, did they? For on the way there, there's an interruption. And there's a woman who's lost in the crowd, in that sea of faces, that large crowd. But you know, she's also willingly lost in that crowd too. She doesn't want to be noticed, and she hides, and she blends in that crowd, undetected, unnoticed. And she has a problem, and her problem was that she had been subject to bleeding for 12 years. And there was no physician that could help her. And we're told that her condition, it wasn't getting better, it was getting worse as time was moving on. And she's very much like Jairus, desperate for healing, and probably also like Jairus, had seen or heard enough that she was convinced that Jesus could make her well, that he could make her better, and it was worth the risk for her. And listen, it was a risk for her going out into that crowd, because that physical condition that she had of bleeding, it would have branded her as an unclean person by the people of her culture, a person to be avoided and held at a distance, definitely not wanted in a crowd where all of the clean people are. But enough had happened to convince this woman that finding Jesus was worth the risk, because she thought this: if I can just touch his cloak, if I can just touch his outer garments, his clothes, if I can just do that, I know I'm going to be healed. I know that I'll be made well. And you know what? She was right. And she does this, and she's healed immediately upon touching Jesus. But I want us to hear something here too. While she was free from her physical issue, she was not completely free just yet. And Jesus was going to do something about that too. And when she touched him, Jesus felt power leave him, and he stops in his tracks, and he says, "Who touched me? Someone touched my clothes. Who was it?" And the disciples, I can just visualize this in my head. Whether it's accurate, I don't know, but like, can you see these guys? Somebody touched Jesus, like, honestly. Come on. Look around. I mean, we are sardined among people here. And somebody touched you. There's people on every side. And if you've been following on through the book of Mark, remember, I think it was Mark chapter 3, where there were people on every side when Jesus was at his home, and it said that they couldn't even raise their arms to eat, not even bread. Who touched me? Come on. But Jesus knew that there was something about this particular touch, and the woman did too. And when she heard him asking who it was, she stops moving in the opposite direction away from him, and she returns back to Jesus. And just like Jairus, she falls at his feet and tells Jesus her whole story, her whole journey that she had just been through, all of her, what was on her heart and what was happening to her and had happened to her. And now, Jesus really freaks her. She came back in fear, trembling, shaking. Oh no. She had hoped for healing, but her hopes were far too small, because the fear and illness that had defined her life for so long, for 12 years, still had a real grip on her. But this is the way of the good news of the gospel, because now Jesus' next words are going to endow her with so much more than she ever could have imagined. Because now she's no longer just a woman, just being called a woman, but now she's being claimed as a daughter, whose faith had made her well, whose faith had saved her. And now words and a promise have been added to the new reality in her life. She could never, ever be lost in the crowd, even if she wanted to be. She could not escape the presence of Jesus. He saw her, and he knew her, and he loved her, and he accepted her completely, and she knew this. And she receives Jesus' benediction that invites her to leave in peace. Shalom. Go in peace. And almost as an afterthought now, by the way, she receives the confirmation in verse 34 that she's been healed of her disease too. That almost becomes an afterthought. And Jesus will always do more than what we imagine. He'll always do more. He always will stir a greater belief within us, moving us to live in trust when we dare to believe and live in faith. But our story isn't over yet, is it? Because in mid-sentence, while Jesus seems to be just breathing or mouthing his benediction on this woman's faith, people arrive and bring this information that Jairus' daughter had died. And in the same instant where one's hopes have soared, another's has been dashed to pieces. And one has been claimed a daughter, and another's daughter has been lost. And faith is clearly at risk here. And the people really make that very clear. Why even trouble the teacher any further? Your daughter, what hope is left? Your daughter is gone. But Jesus is never going to let this be. Jesus' words will not let dashed hopes and fears remain in check. And he says to Jairus, do not fear, only believe. And once again, his words call attention to the thin line between fear and faith. Stop being afraid and go on living in faith. Go on living in trust, Jairus. And the transforming power of Jesus' words would change Jairus forever. And the transforming power of Jesus' words will change our own lives forever too. From fear to trust. And within this story, Jesus' words of promise with the prospect of transformation from fear to faith, it's as good as done as we follow along in this story still. And it remains that the rest of the story, we just simply fill in the details. And as we read them, we're kind of holding our breath with somewhat of an air of delight that is within us too. As we read the working out of the outcome. And we smile as we oversee the weeping and the mourning that's going on because we know the rest of the story. And maybe we even wink unknowingly, or at the unknowing crowd of where all this misplaced laughter is coming from. When Jesus says, she's not dead, she's asleep, and there's that laughter. We know what's going on. And we know where this story is going. And our hearts are drawn when Jesus takes the little girl by the hand and he says, arise. And we applaud the crowd in their amazement at what had just happened, especially since it matches our own amazement and wonder at these two stories in which faith and salvation and healing have met together in the presence and power of Jesus Christ. And once again, we're left to wonder a little bit too of Jesus' commands. Now, don't tell anyone. we are certainly invited to do this, though. We're invited to continue to ask just where this story intends to take us, where it intends to lead us. What will it be like to follow Jesus on the journey of discipleship that he is calling us to embark on, to carry on in? In what way will our lives be transformed by the one who calls us to stop being afraid, do not fear, and live by trust? Trust in the promise of the good news of God's kingdom among us. Well, Cheryl read a little bit from Lamentations. It's kind of a gloomy, well, almost a downer sort of, what's Lamentations? Filled with laments, where a poet is writing from a heart that is pained. And the verses that were read for us, that he's dry, and the silence is getting to him, and the author is waiting, and he's wondering when the silence is going to end. But he's not giving up faith either. Verse 25 and 26 of Lamentations 3. The Lord is good to those whose hope is in him. To the one who seeks him, it is good to wait quietly for the salvation of the Lord. God notices us wherever we are at in our lives. God notices us when we are in pain. He notices everything that is going on around us and within us. He always notices us. And we can never, ever become lost in a crowd. Even if we wanted to, we can't. We cannot get lost in a crowd or among a sea of faces, because God will always find you on whatever road you're on. And he will meet you. And he will give you what you need. And he will not leave you alone. And so we can believe this. And we can trust this. And we can live with trust. There's an author by the name of Mark Buchanan, a Canadian author. And he's also pastor of the New Life Community Baptist Church in Duncan, BC. And he shared this memory from one of his writings of his childhood. And it has to do with his own dad. And Mark and his older brother, they were playing street hockey on the street, like a lot of Canadian kids will do, in front of their home. And as they're playing out on the street, the neighborhood bully happened to come by. And he was a really big kid. He was 3 years older than Mark. And often he'd push Mark around on the way to and from school. He'd push him, shove him, punch. And on this occasion, the kid, this big guy, he walked onto the front yard as the kids were playing on the street. He picked up Mark's bike and he began to horse around with this thing, treating it very roughly. And Mark yelled at him to stop. Stop. And what a lot of kids, when they hear that kind of remark, when they're trying to get a reaction, why don't you make me? And so Mark walked over to him. And this kid threw Mark's bike to the ground, and then he threw Mark to the ground. And then he jumped on top of him and began to hit him, blow after blow after blow. And then it stopped. And Mark looked up, and he saw his oppressor hovering against the sky with a look of terror on his face. Because Mark's dad had been watching this whole event from the window. And he saw the antics that were going on, and he came to Mark's defense, and he grabbed the boy by the collar of his jacket, and he lifted him straight off the ground, like a man hanging from a noose, and he shook him. And he said, "Don't you ever, ever do that to my son again. Don't you ever hurt him again." And it was all over. Not just that incident, but this kid never bothered Mark ever again. And Mark basked in the love of his dad for weeks. And here was love that he could count on to protect him, even defend him against his enemies, to make things right. So how much more now? How much more will our Heavenly Father be there for us? Because God sees you and God knows you, and without fear you can approach him, and we do. We do that in humility, with a contrite heart. And why? Because God is holy. And in him there is freedom, where our deepest need will be met. Because we are sons of God, daughters of God. And God says in Hebrews 13, God said, "Never will I leave you, never will I forsake you." So we say with confidence, "The Lord is my helper, and I will not be afraid." And Jesus will not let hopes be dashed, and he will not let fears be unchecked. So do not fear, he says, but only believe and live in trust. Because as Psalm 27 says, "The Lord is my light and my salvation. Whom shall I fear? No one. Nothing. And for that we can be grateful. We can be forever grateful. Are you forever grateful? Let's stand, let's sing that together. I'm forever grateful.
You did not wait for me to draw near to you.